Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. We've got some more GMade GOM this week. We're most of the way through the manual now and very nearly have a working chassis. The first step this week is going to be step 55, where we're putting together the yokes for the drive shafts. Now I do like that these parts are separate rather than lost on one of the big parts trees. It makes them really easy to find. For metal bits we need 4 of the centre square parts. They call them the universal joint, but I tend to think of the whole working assembly as the universal rather than just the one part. 4 pins, which they call universal drive couplers, which sounds like a good name, but I think I'm still going to call them pins, because it's shorter. And then to hold it all together we've got 4 2mm E-clips. To assemble, all we do is slide one of the square bits with the large holes lining up with the holes in the yokes. Slide a pin through the large hole in the yoke, through the square bit and out the other side. Then we just clip an E-clip over the end. Repeat with the other 3 and we're done. Step 56, the rest of the drive shafts. We'll need the actual drive shafts this time. Now on the parts tree there's 2 lengths of the outer shaft. You can hold the shaft against the diagram to get the right one, but the GOM is a fairly large truck, so it would have been a safe bet that it wasn't going to be the short one. We'll also need a pair of inner shafts, and there's only one length to choose from this time. There's the 4 metal pins. These are smaller than the other set as they pass through the bigger pins to make the cruciform. And lastly, there's the 4 E-clips to hold it all together. Putting this end together is a bit more of a fiddle than the other. We need to turn the pin on the inside so it's lined up with the hole in the square bit. Then, once they're in line, you can fit the drive shaft. The trouble is, if you disturb the metal bits, the small pin won't go through without catching. Even if you do get the parts to go together smoothly, a little bit of a jiggle on the pin on the way in can just help things along. When the pin's in place, all we do is pop an E-clip on to stop it falling out. Repeat with the other 3 joints, and we've got ourselves a set of drive shafts. That just leaves the final sub-step of inserting the inners into the outers. Not much to say, it doesn't really matter what the orientation is, but I like to have the yokes lined up just because it looks a bit neater. Step 57, fitting the front drive shaft. Now there's really not much to this one. We'll need one of the drive shafts of course, along with an M3x15 screw pin. All we do is fit the yoke on the end of the drive shaft with the inner spline over the gearbox output. Pop the pin through the hole and tighten it up, which is easier said than done. As with a lot of the screws in the kit, they can be a bit of a pain to get the thread started. A quick bevel with a knife will get it to bite though. Now that it's actually going in, we only need to tighten it up so it's snug. As soon as you feel it start to stiffen up, stop. The head of the screw pin should be just somewhere near flush or perhaps slightly below the surface. Step 58. The rear drive shaft, which is exactly the same as the front, so we'll just call that one done. Step 59, fitting the front axle. We need a few screws for this one, an M3x30 cap head, an M3x18 dome head, 2 M3 nylocks, an M3x15 screw pin, and an M3x20 dome head. And of course we're going to need the front axle. That would be the one with the steering bits. Right, the front axle has 3 links to fit. The single top link slots into the mounting points on the truss, and the 30mm long screw goes all the way through and threads into the plastic. Like a lot of the fixings, the screw doesn't need to be done up tight, just bottom out the head and it will be just fine. It's only got to be tight enough that it's not going to fall out. Next, before we fit the lower links, we'll hook up the drive shaft. It's just like the gearbox end, give the edges of the hole a bit of a bevel and screw in the screw pin. We need to do it now, as once the lower links are bolted up, there's not going to be enough clearance to get the yoke over the shaft on the axle. The lower links slot into the mounts on the axle and have an M3x18 on one side and an M3x20 on the other, so pay attention to the manual when fitting them. To keep them in we use the M3 nylocks. As usual, we only need to tighten them up so they're snug. If you overdo it, you'll find the plastic will crack after just a couple of tumbles. The little nut driver really comes in very handy in the tight spaces here. You'd struggle to get a standard socket or Tamiya wrench in there. You'd probably have to fall back on a small open-ended spanner to do the nuts up. With them all done up, the axle's still a bit floppy, but that's because we haven't fitted the panhard bar yet. When that goes on, it should be a really nice setup. Step 60, the rear axle, and this one's more or less the same as the front as you might expect. We're going to need two M3x18 dome heads, an M3x30 cap head, two M3 nylocks, another screw pin, and of course the rear axle. The main difference is we've got two upper links this time. They just fit into the slots in the truss and get the 30mm long screw fitted. Do it up just like the front one, remembering not to overdo the tightness. Next we've got the drive shaft and fitting the yoke, which is almost out of frame, but we've done it a few times now, so I'm sure you know what you're doing. The lower links, which are the same as the front, except we've got two screws the same length this time. Once the last two screws and nuts are nipped up, we've got a very solid yet flexible 4-link setup. I'm sure when the plastic ball ends get stretched a bit it's going to wobble, but for now it does feel rather nice. Now, next would be step 61, which are the dampers, but I think they really want a video on their own. They don't quite go together like your usual kit dampers, so I think I'm going to leave it there for this week. The chassis is almost complete now. I think in the next video we should have it supporting its own weight, ready for the cage and body panels. So, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment if you've got something to say. Bye guys!